The homes, residences, and birthplaces of many former US presidents are well represented in the national park system. Of America's 46 presidents, 19 of them, over 40%, have an NPS unit dedicated to a place where they lived, were born, called home, or commemorates them in some way. Some have multiple sites, totaling 34 different units of the national park system by my count. In this video, I'm going to walk you through every American president and the national park units that apply to them. But first, some ground rules. Number one, we're only covering park sites that are ostensibly dedicated to a president's life or accomplishments. So birthplaces, homes, residents, those are all eligible. Monuments, memorials, commemorative sites, those are fine too. What won't be included in a list like this is like historic sites that a president is associated with. So no Valley Forge for George Washington, no Ford's Theater for Lincoln, no Appomattox Courthouse for Grant. Those sorts of places aren't included here. Number two, and it should go without saying, but we're only considering properties that are currently protected by the National Park Service. So places like Mount Vernon and Monticello are historically preserved, usually by nonprofit foundations, but they are not part of the national park system and are thus ineligible for this list. All right, that's all the housekeeping I have. Let's get started. First up is George Washington, and while Mount Vernon is not part of the national park system, the place where G-Dubs was actually born is. This site is the George Washington Birthplace National Monument in Colonial Beach, Virginia, about 20 miles south of Mount Vernon. The home here is not original, but is a best guess recreation based on historical evidence. George Washington also has 3 other NPS locations dedicated to him, those being, of course, the Washington Monument, Mount Rushmore National Memorial, where he is one of 4 presidents carved into the facade of the Black Hills, and the George Washington Memorial Parkway in and around Washington, D.C. Also, a quick word on D.C. monuments for you park administration nerds. All the major monuments and memorials there are technically separate individual NPS units. They are all just administered together under the National Mall and Memorial Parks. A lot of these are going to come up in this list, so if you're wondering why I'm including them individually, that is why. All right, moving on. Next up is John Adams, who has one site dedicated to him, that of Adams National Historical Park in Boston, Massachusetts. Both John Adams and our 6th president, John Quincy Adams, were born here. The park protects a collection of buildings, several of which are open for tours, that were part of the farm where 4 generations of Adamses lived. For Thomas Jefferson, no former properties of his are protected by the National Park Service. He's actually the only president on this list for which this is the case, but he does, of course, have the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., and is also carved into Mount Rushmore. All right, Madison and Monroe each have no NPS sites, and John Quincy Adams has Adams National Historical Park, which we already talked about, and Andrew Jackson doesn't have any. So let's move on to Martin Van Buren. Van Buren has one park site dedicated to him, that of the Martin Van Buren National Historic Site in Kinderhook, New York. This park preserves Van Buren's former home, Lindenwold, along with several acres of grounds and farmland, which is actually still active. The home is available for tours, which I have to say are fantastic. Highly recommend. All right, from there, none of William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, or James Buchanan have national park sites dedicated to them. So we'll move on to none other than Abraham Lincoln, the president with the 2nd most national park sites on this list. Those are, number 1, Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Historical Park in Hodgenville, Kentucky, where Honest Abe was obviously born. There is a log cabin here, and for a long time it was thought this was the actual cabin Lincoln was born in, but that turned out not to be the case. There is a replica cabin here enshrined in this kind of out-of-place neoclassical monument thing. It's pretty cool to visit, if a little strange looking for the area where it's located in. Now, Lincoln did not live here long. His family moved to Indiana when he was young, which is why we have the Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial in Lincoln City, Indiana. There's a lot more land associated with this park, including the cemetery where Lincoln's mother is buried, and a living history farm that is operated using methods that the Lincolns themselves would have used back in the 19th century. Lincoln State Park is across the street from here as well. The last official residence associated with Lincoln is the Lincoln Home National Historic Site in Springfield, Illinois. This is the only home Lincoln ever owned. It's where he was living when he was elected president, and it is original. It still stands today, and yes, you can tour it. After that, Lincoln obviously has the Lincoln Memorial in DC, and is yet again also carved into Mount Rushmore. After Lincoln, there's Andrew Johnson. He has the Andrew Johnson National Historic Site dedicated to him, located in Greenville, Tennessee. This site protects the homestead of America's 17th president and interprets his life, especially in the context of his Reconstruction-era presidency following the end of the Civil War. After Johnson, there's Ulysses S. Grant, the former Union general and 18th president. He has two NPS sites in his honor. The first is the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis, Missouri, which protects the former Grant home, Whitehaven, where he and his wife, it was her house actually, lived from 1854 to 1859, as well as several other historic buildings on the property. The second site is the General Grant National Memorial in New York City, where the Grants moved after leaving the White House. Both General Grant and his wife are buried here, and the site is home to the largest mausoleum in North America. All right, moving on. Rutherford B. Hayes does not have a park site in his honor, so we move to James A. Garfield, who does. He is honored at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Minner, Ohio. This site protects the home of former President Garfield, where he famously ran his presidential campaign from his front porch, thus giving us the term front porch campaign. You can visit that front porch and the house because it's open to guided tours. It has excellent interpretive staff and exhibits, and it isn't too far from Cuyahoga Valley National Park, so make sure to stop by if you're visiting. After Garfield, none of Chester A. Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, or William McKinley have NPS sites, so we arrive at last to my favorite president and the one who has the most NPS locations dedicated to him, Teddy Roosevelt. TR has three former residences now protected by the National Park Service. The first is the Theodore Roosevelt Birthplace National Historic Site in New York City, one of the least visited and smallest units of the national park system, despite being located smack dab in the middle of Manhattan. It's a great park, I highly recommend it. After that, you've got Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, TR's former home on Long Island, where he lived from 1885 until his death in 1919. Teddy valued this area for its natural beauty and recreation opportunities, and it was known as his summer White House. You can tour the house and visit the 83 acres that the park now protects to get a feel for how TR might have lived his life when not at the White House. The final residence, now protected by the National Park Service, is actually located in Teddy Roosevelt National Park itself in North Dakota. This is the only national park named after a person, and while it is dedicated to him and honors his legacy as America's premier national parks president, he did live here as well. This is a multi-unit park, and tucked in between the park's two larger north and south units lies the much smaller blink and you'll miss it Elkhorn Ranch unit, which protects the location of the former president's cattle ranch, where he came to heal a broken heart and learn to love the vast, wide open spaces of the American West. Now, as for the other sites, I know I said I wasn't including sites of historical events, but we're making an exception here for the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site in Buffalo, New York, because, well, his name is right there in the site's title, and the site really does revolve heavily around him. This site protects the location where TR was inaugurated following the assassination of William McKinley, and does a fantastic job of interpreting these events and the time period that they took place in. It's actually one of my all-time favorite national park sites. After that, there are two more commemorative sites associated with Teddy Roosevelt. He is the last president on this list to be carved into Mount Rushmore, but there's also Theodore Roosevelt Island in the middle of the Potomac in downtown Washington, D.C., a nice natural respite from the hustle and bustle of the nation's capital. Very fitting for a president like TR. Moving on from Teddy, we arrive at William Howard Taft, who does have his own site, the William Howard Taft National Historic Site in Cincinnati, Ohio. The site protects the home where Taft was born and raised and is open for tours. Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, and Calvin Coolidge don't have any park sites, so we arrive at Herbert Hoover, who has the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site in West Branch, Iowa. This site protects the place where Hoover was born and raised until age 9 when he became an orphan. Hoover later attributed a lot of the values he lived by to this location in rural Iowa. After Hoover, we come to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, one of America's most famous presidents. It might surprise you to learn that he only has 2 NPS sites in his honor. The first is the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt National Historic Site in Hyde Park, New York, site of the Roosevelt family estate. The Roosevelts at one point had 1,500 acres here, although the National Park Service now protects only 898 of those. And even though she wasn't a president, she was a first lady, and the Eleanor Roosevelt National Historic Site is also located here on this property, managed jointly with the FDR site. And then, of course, FDR is one of the presidents with a memorial in DC, the FDR Memorial along the tidal basin. Following FDR came Truman, who has the Harry S. Truman National Historic Site dedicated to him, located in Independence, Missouri. The house was built by Truman's wife Elizabeth's grandfather in 1867, but the couple lived here from 1919 to 1972. Elizabeth, or Bess as she was known, donated the house to the National Park Service in 1982 upon her death. Now we come to Dwight D. Eisenhower, who has the Eisenhower National Historic Site in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, dedicated in his honor. It's literally adjacent to Gettysburg National Military Park, preserves the farm of the former president, and was donated to the National Park Service by the Eisenhowers in 1967, although it did not open as a National Historic Site until 1980. Eisenhower also has the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C. Next up is John F. Kennedy, JFK. You'll find the John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site in Boston, Massachusetts, one of the smallest units of the National Park System. This site protects a single home in Boston's Brookline neighborhood, the family home of the Kennedys. The site is open for tours, either guided or self-led. After JFK, you've got LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. LBJ was from Texas, and that is where you will find the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park. This is actually a multi-unit park protecting LBJ's boyhood home in downtown Johnson City and the family ranch nearby. The ranch is still operational today, one of a few cattle ranches run and operated by the National Park Service. LBJ spent a lot of time here during his presidency. It was known as the Texas White House during his time in office, and you can still explore much of this property today. LBJ also has a DC park site dedicated to him, the LBJ Memorial Grove on the Potomac, a nice strip of parkland along the Potomac on the Virginia side of the river. Richard Nixon does not have any NPS sites dedicated to him, neither does Gerald Ford, but Jimmy Carter does. The peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia has the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park dedicated in his honor in the town where he grew up and still lives today, the oldest living president at the time I'm recording this. This is another multi-unit park with locations at the Boyhood Home and Farm, the Railroad Depot turned campaign headquarters, and the Old Plains High School that Jimmy Carter attended. All 3 are open to visit, and together these locations tell the story of Jimmy Carter and the things that influenced him in his long and storied life. Now, next up is Ronald Reagan, which I will just say right now, there are no NPS sites dedicated to Ronald Reagan. However, a Ronald Reagan National Historic Site has been authorized since 2002, but the site cannot be dedicated as an official national park unit until the property is acquired by the federal government. The foundations that have been involved with the site through the years, though, don't want that to happen, because they want to run the house in accordance with Reagan's own philosophies, no government intervention. So this remains a little quirk of the national park system for now. It's pretty much in limbo. All right, George H.W. Bush does not have a national park site, and thus we come to the last president on this list to have a national park property dedicated in their honor, Bill Clinton. We also come to perhaps the most obnoxiously named national park site in the country. Take a deep breath here. The President William Jefferson Clinton Birthplace Home National Historic Site. I mean, seriously, they couldn't take a page from the other 18 presidents on this list and give the place a more reasonable name. Come on. In any case though, this site is located in Hope, Arkansas and protects the boyhood home of our 42nd president. And like I said, he is the last president on this list. No MPS properties for Bush 2, Obama, Trump, or Biden, unless you count Mar-a-Lago, which used to be a national park site in which I have a whole video on. Oh, and every president except Washington has lived in the White House. Also a national park unit, also have a video on that. So it goes on this list too. But yes, this concludes our tour through the presidential properties, birthplaces, monuments, and commemorative sites protected by the national park system. These places are so important to protect for me because they give us so much insight into the people and places and values that shaped the leaders who would come to occupy the nation's highest office. Presidents get a lot of coverage for what they do in office, but very little is dedicated to their childhoods, the places where they grew up, the people who influenced them, who shaped their values. These places give us the opportunity to understand our leaders on a much deeper level. And as is so often the case with the parks I visit, I'm glad they're protected for us to see today. Let me know what presidential homes you visited in the comments, or if you think I missed one. Follow me on Instagram, and direct support is always appreciated on Patreon. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.